One of the great things about gardening is there's always more to learn, especially if you have a crazy project like I have with 7 family scale gardens, each following a different method, and a much larger black plot that has so much more potential. Every season offers new opportunities for learning, and last year was no different. Looking back at the season, I think that some of the things that I learned or perhaps relearned were quite general and perhaps a bit obvious, whereas other things were fairly particular insights that offered me a greater understanding about what was going on. And I think reviewing an eclectic mix of a range of these things offers an interesting insight into what happened during the season. This past year, I've had a total of 1,800 square meters of space to potentially grow in, which is almost half an acre. So it's not surprising that this ended up being way too much, and I didn't grow anything in more than half of the available space, with most of the 1,000 square meter area of the black plot remaining uncultivated. When I first took on this larger space a number of years ago, I had intended to get the help of interns or woofers or other volunteers to help with the workload. But this past season, I decided to go it alone for a variety of personal reasons, and so I just didn't manage to get the work done. So this coming season, I need to either get more help or put in a lot more work or reduce the amount of space that I'm trying to grow in or find ways to more efficiently manage the space that I do have. The most prominent weather event of the season was the unusually long dry period with almost no rain in the 8 weeks between the end of May and the last week of July. In Ireland, we're generally not prepared for extended periods without rain, especially when associated with a heat wave, and problems with the water supply on my site made it even worse. Getting enough water to all the plants absorbed way too much time and effort, which caused me to cut back on the amount of land that I was trying to cultivate, and I also dropped a lot of my planting plans for later in the season. If I had been better prepared or had made the effort to quickly set up better infrastructure, the impact would have been much less, and I could have grown a lot more vegetables in what otherwise would have been a very good growing season. I dug a few test holes during the drought and found that the soil was really dry to the full depth of the plant roots, but patches of bare soil without plants seem to have retained a lot more soil moisture. A bit of research confirmed that in many cases the amount of water sucked out of the soil and transpired into the air by the plants themselves often greatly exceeds the amount that is evaporated from the surface of the soil. This means that mulching the surface of the soil in the garden to conserve water will only help so much, and that perhaps the only option for conserving water deeper in the soil is to grow fewer plants. Digging those exploration holes and some of the research I did into potential evapotranspiration rates made me realize that I should have been watering a lot more than I did. A common approach across many of the gardens is to try to be more productive, to be able to harvest more from a given area, generally by taking a more intensive approach and planting plants closer together. But this can be problematic if the plants can't get the resources that they need, including enough fertility, sunlight, and most importantly this season, a consistent supply of water. The extensive garden takes a different approach, with a lot more space being given to each plant, and this definitely played off in this stressful season, with some significantly better crops from this garden, especially the beetroot and cauliflower. The extra space allowed the individual plants to grow much bigger, and I was surprised how much tastier the beetroot and cauliflower from this garden was compared to the other gardens, and I think the extra space made all the difference when the soil moisture was scarce. I had big plans for growing a succession of crops in my relatively new polytunnel in the black plot last year, including lots of tomatoes, cucumbers, and other heat-loving plants. But by late spring I realized that I was facing a lot of issues in this high-value growing space, including poor soil fertility, not enough compost, a few problematic diseases, and not enough time to look after everything adequately. So I made the really radical decision to abandon my plans and all the plants that were ready to transplant, to clear out the weeds, to properly remineralize the soil, and then to sow a green manure and start again next season. I hadn't done enough work to properly establish the soil in this polytunnel when I set it up, and restarting seemed a better approach than trying to catch up, which ended up being a really good call with the drought and water supply issues later in this season and the extreme heat event that happened later on. I used to think that the only real threat to a polytunnel was high winds, and I've seen the impact and potential destruction of this firsthand. What I hadn't considered is that the plastic of a polytunnel is also easily damaged by fire, which may be a more common threat in some of the drier parts of the world, but it's not here in damp Ireland. But last autumn, a raging fire close to my new polytunnel caused huge sections of the plastic to melt, severely damaging the structural integrity of the polytunnel. I ended up having to replace the entire sheet of plastic, as I knew it would not stand up to the winter storms. But after all this work, this polytunnel is now in much better state for the future. A few years ago, I built a simple and robust compost sieve, but this past season I realized just how useful and adaptable it can be. I found that by adjusting the slope on it, it became a lot more useful in different situations and for sieving compost of different qualities. I also found that it was really useful in clearing new ground, especially in really rough sites with lots of perennial weeds and other soil debris. It was a lot of work to dig out and sieve all of the weed roots and stones and to break up all the clumps, but it left behind a lovely loose soil that will be much easier to manage for many years to come. I used to mainly grow lettuce and other salad greens as larger, widely spaced plants, and then harvested the whole mature plant or individual leaves. But this year I tried a few other methods that I've seen used by market gardeners, and I've found them to be much easier, more productive, and with a faster crop. I was quite surprised that a bed of greens grown in the polytunnel this past spring could produce between 3 and 5 kilograms of really nice salad leaves per square meter of bed, with harvesting lasting over many weeks. I used to think that greens like this were a low-yielding or infill or secondary crop, but now I see that they can be an easy and highly productive crop, which should probably be a bigger focus of what I grow and what we eat. With the extended drought, work pressures, and my frustration with the season, most of the gardens produced a lot less than they could have, but the simple garden produced the best results out of all of them. Although the yield was less than it was the previous season, I still have loads of squash, potatoes, carrots, and onions from this garden to see me through the winter, while there is very little left to eat from the other gardens. Apart from a lot of watering, these 4 main crops only needed a little bit of care during the main part of the season when I had the least amount of time. This made this garden much more resilient in my opinion, while the other gardens really faltered as I didn't have the time or focus to keep going with the production that I had planned or the management and timely harvest of the greater diversity of crops. In contrast to the simple garden, the polyculture garden was perhaps the least successful this season, mainly because I failed to focus enough time to thin the dense polyculture sowings. The competition between too many young plants for space, fertility, and soil moisture was really compounded by the dry conditions and the excessive heat, and I just didn't get enough water into the beds. The theory and possibility of abundance associated with this polycrop method, with plants finding different niches within the soil, the intercropping, and the potential benefits of companion planting, was overrun by resource scarcity and a lack of focus on my part, making this garden a lot less resilient. Most of the crops yielded worse than they did in the other gardens, and even worse than they did the previous season, except for the overwintering garlic and onions, which were widely spaced and well established and mature before the competition from the intercropping of carrots and parsnip would have had an impact during the drought. When I originally established the locations of these family-scale gardens, I set them out alphabetically as I couldn't think of another reason for organizing them. A few years later, I moved the polyculture garden to a new space at the other end and replaced it with a perennial garden when I realized that the polyculture method required much more attention and daily focus, and I needed to be closer to the entrance path so that I would pass it more frequently. This year, I realized that the no-dig garden would also have benefited from being further down the slope and much closer to the road, or rather, I would have benefited from not having to haul so much compost the longer distance up the hill. Since I have switched this garden to following Charles Dowding's method of mulching with a thick layer of compost, getting the 60 to 80 wheelbarrow loads of imported compost up to the gardens was by far the biggest and hardest task of the season. For several years now, I've had issues with carrot fly in my carrots, with the burrowing larvae severely damaging and stunting many of my crops. I've tried using garlic sprays, low barriers, and interplanting with onions, and a variety of different covers, and now I won't grow them unless they're completely covered for the whole season with a high quality and reasonably expensive mesh. But even then, several of my carrot crops last year had been badly affected, and a few carrot flies seem to have been able to get into all the crops. It seems that these tiny flies are able to find any small hole in the mesh, or to get in under the edge, and if they get into the crop early enough, they can multiply fast enough to be able to damage almost every carrot in the batch. I had heard about the possibility of growing microgreens from a few market gardeners that I've learned a lot from, but I thought that they were only really useful to grow if you had access to high-value urban markets or sold directly to high-end restaurants. I was also a bit wary of the amount of growing medium needed and the cost of the seed, and felt that it was perhaps a bit of a waste to get so little out of the precious seeds. But I tried growing a few batches, and I realized that harvesting baby plants at the microgreen or mini leaf stage can produce a decent yield of a high value crop in very little time. I ended up increasing my production to partially make up for a gap in availability of other crops from the gardens, when I realized that microgreens would make a really useful crop to grow to help fill the hunger gap, even for people growing only for themselves. One of the benefits of keeping detailed records of everything harvested and all of the time that I spend managing each of the family scale gardens is that I can get broad generalized data out of all of the details. One calculation that I made last year was that the gardens in 2017, which was a reasonable year for growing, produced an average of about 5 kilograms of mixed vegetables per square meter of garden, or about 10 kilograms per square meter in the shelter of the polytunnel. I was also able to calculate that each of the gardens took 1 hour of work over the entire season to produce 5 kilograms of vegetables, with surprisingly little variation between the gardens, except for the simple garden, which was much more time efficient. I think that the calculations of 5 kilograms per hour and 5 kilograms per square meter and the related 1 hour per square meter are all useful metrics or general rules of thumb, and I've found myself using them quite regularly ever since. Looking back at the season, it's easy to blame a number of different events or factors for all the things that didn't go so well, but I think a lot of it comes down to how well I was able to keep up with the workload. Other growers may be able to focus a lot better, but I found that my work output definitely declined at key times during the year, and the garden suffered as a result. It seems that when I become demoralized with what's going on, I tend to abandon crops or gardens or fail to keep up with all the work that needs to be done. This is perhaps a common and natural response, but I've come to realize that my morale is perhaps the most valuable resource in the gardens, and I need to find ways of being better able to manage it in the future. Although it's not related specifically to the gardens, another key thing that I learned last year was that building a YouTube audience and raising ongoing funding through Patreon can be difficult. I'm really delighted with the response that this YouTube channel has had so far, and I want to thank all those people who have watched and shared, liked and subscribed, and commented on all the videos that I've uploaded. And I especially want to thank that smaller group of people who have taken that extra step to support this project by contributing to my Patreon page. Looking back at the growth rate of views and pledges, I had hoped that there would be much more steady growth so that I could more quickly reach a point where this project could start paying for itself. But sometimes things take longer to develop and grow, and I realize that I need to pay more attention to producing more videos on a regular basis. That's perhaps my biggest goal for this coming season, and I hope you'll continue to watch the videos that I do upload, and thanks so much for watching this one right through to the very end.